We all know what's about to happen, so let's just cut to the chase and turn Fulgrim into a chaos-corrupted Vulkan. To kick things off, I began by clipping away the parts to build Fulgrim's tail. I didn't plan on adjusting this part of the model too much, so after clipping away the parts and cleaning them up, I simply followed the instructions on how to assemble them. However, there were a few small decorative changes that needed to be made, specifically the Slaaneshi amulets hanging from the central fin. One side of these were quite straightforward to remove, and I achieved this easily with my clippers. The opposite side, however, required a little more work. I removed these steadily by shaving down the amulets with my knife before smoothing out the surface again. Once the Slaaneshi details had been removed, I then added these sections to the rest of the tail. But before I continued, I decided to add a little Salamander-inspired flair. In terms of aesthetics, the Salamanders feature a lot of runes, hammer symbols, and flame motifs. Fortunately, the Fire Slayers from Age of Sigmar also feature these details, which meant I could replace these Slaaneshi details with some taken from the Hearthguard kit. Once the runes were in place, I continued to assemble the tail. Once I'd fully assembled the tail, my next task was to remove that weird Slaaneshi symbol from the open wound of the front. I initially considered doing my usual clip and shave, but the resultant surface would be pretty bland and featureless. So instead, I decided to cover it up by mixing up some green stuff, some Milliput Superfine, and then mix the two together. I've better covered the benefits of this hybrid mix and sculpting putty in my dedicated sculpting video, but, put simply, the mix gives you the best of both worlds. After creating my mixture, I then rolled the putty flat against my cutting board and used a rolling pin and a little Vaseline to prevent it from sticking to both. Once I was happy with the thickness, I then left the putty to partly cure for around an hour or so. By allowing the putty to cure for an hour, it firmed up just enough to retain its shape, while still being malleable to sculpt and adjust. But before I did any sculpting, I first cut out more of a defined loincloth shape. Using a steel rule and my scalpel, I cut straight lines into each long side before then slicing out some rips and tears from the bottom. By adding several uneven cuts, it created the appearance of a ragged material. Once I had my rough loincloth shape achieved, I carefully lifted the putty off the cutting mat and placed it onto the front of the snake body. Then, using a combination of my hard-tipped and rubber-tipped sculpting tools, as well as plenty of Vaseline, I began the slow process of adding creases and folds to the fabric. During this step, you're trying to recreate how a cloth-like material would sit. You'd expect it to be bunched up more towards the top, with deep folds and creases, with these tapering out into flatter surfaces as it moved downwards. During this step, I made sure to keep the top V-shape clear so that it could still add the torso to it later on, and once I was happy with the shape of the cloth, I allowed the putty to cure fully overnight. But even after leaving the putty to fully cure, I wasn't done with it just yet. The benefit of creating a Milliput mix was the ability to shave, file, and sand down the surfaces. This allowed me to refine those creases and folds in the material, helping to sharpen up the edges, whilst also smoothing out the texture. Matching the texture of the plastic around the putty is important for helping the sculpted parts to blend into the rest of the model once the part is painted. So far, I had a good starting point for the sculpted on loincloth, but it needed more detail. To fix this, I decided to dip into that pot of salamander theming and add some scales. While these can be time consuming, they are actually really straightforward to achieve. Simply mix up some plain green stuff, roll out a small ball, add a dot of superglue to the surface, and then press the ball flat with the rounded end of a paintbrush. This created an irregularly shaped disc with a small dip in the center. As I continued to lay down these discs, they steadily formed the appearance of scales. These were built up across the surface of the loincloth, with me focusing more towards the top, with them dissipating as they moved downwards. While I waited for the green stuff to cure, I turned my attention to the upper torso and assembled the main torso as per the instructions. However, I did remove the small crescent moon from the center of the torso. This was part of a larger Slaaneshi symbol, so removing it reduced that Slaanesh influence somewhat. Then, after gluing the side sections of the armor, my next problem appeared in the form of the lower arm joints. I didn't plan on using these during my Vulkan build, so they needed to be blocked out. Ultimately, I decided to once again benefit from that salamander-like design and borrow from the Dwarven range. Settling on these Iron Drake shoulder pads, I first clipped down the sides a little before flattening them, which allowed me to glue them to the sides. Putting the torso to one side for the moment, I next turned my attention towards the weaponry. Vulkan is famously equipped with his hammer Dawnbringer, and to create a chaos-corrupted version of this, I started out with this Hellbrute hammer. To attach it to Fulgrim's arm though, it first needed to be clipped away from the Hellbrute arm. Once removed, I shaved the contact point flat before also removing the blade from Fulgrim's arm. Now, attaching this new weapon to the original handle would require a little extra reinforcement to ensure a strong enough bond. To do this, I first drilled a 1mm hole into the hammer and then another into the sword's hilt. My reinforcement took the form of a length of 1mm steel wire that was superglued into the hammer, clipped down so just a few millimeters were left protruding, and then glued into the sword arm, completing the bond. Finally, to help bulk out the arm just a little bit, I glued on some of the wrist armor from a Mark III Space Marine. For the right arm, I assembled things as per the instructions and added on another Mark III wrist guard. With the arms built, I next shifted my attention to the head. I wanted to really lean into that draconian aspect of the model and use a suitable reptilian head. After trying out a few options, I ultimately settled on this Croxagore head. After gluing the two halves of the head together, I compared it against the torso. From this, I could see that part of the neck needed to be clipped away, and I began a series of comparisons and trims until I was able to fit the new head into the neck, at which point I made the bond permanent with some glue. The bond wasn't perfect though, and there were a few gaps left that needed to be filled in. These gaps were cleaned up by pressing more Milliput/green stuff mix into the neck. This was a little tricky though, as it needed to be pushed into the gap from the inside, which saw me awkwardly poking the putty in through the shoulders. With the gaps filled, I smoothed these out and left the Milliput green stuff mix to fully cure. But the head alone wasn't quite enough to convey that dragon aspect I was looking to create for Vulkan, and so I returned to the Fireslayer range for some help. My solution was a set of Magmadroth horns, which I clipped in half, compared, adjusted, compared again, and adjusted some more until I could glue the horns to the Croxagore head. With the head complete, I could return to the arms, but before I could do anything, the wings needed to be assembled. These were assembled as intended, but I didn't attach them to the torso yet. I did, however, remove the small nubs from the arms before gluing these to the torso. While my take on Vulkan is quite different from the original Primarch mini, it didn't mean that I couldn't draw inspiration from it. To somewhat create the kind of shoulder pads he wears, I looked towards the Space Marine Centurion kit. These were the ideal size, but did require some careful shaving, scraping, and smoothing of the plates to create a featureless surface. To further continue that aesthetic line from the original miniature, I next took one of the head options from the Gothizzar Harvester of the Ossiarch Bone Reapers range. Its jaw was then clipped away and kept to one side for the time being. Once I cleaned it up, this skull would help me to recreate the original Vulkan's Fire Drake skull. But first, those shoulder pads needed to be attached. This required me to dry fit the wings to ensure that once my shoulder pads were glued on, they wouldn't prevent me from attaching the wings later on. With the right pad fixed into place, the skull was then compared, adjusted, and glued to the shoulder. As the model steadily came together, it helped to highlight parts that didn't quite look right, and these were the chests and the arms. Both just looked a little too slender and needed to be bulked out somewhat. For the arms, I grabbed a few more dwarf shoulder pads and glued these to the elbows. Combined with the earlier Mark III wrist guards, these helped to chunk out the arms a little. When it came to the chest, I felt that I could kill several birds with one stone by taking the chest plate from the Adrax Agatone miniature. This piece would give me that added bulk, cover up the gap where the wing would normally fix, and give me some nice salamander styling. To attach the plate, I did first have to clip away and retain that small piece of cloak before trimming down the underside. After several careful trims and comparisons, the plate was glued to the torso. As I mentioned earlier, I kept a hold of those lower jaws from the Gothizzar Harvester, which was fortunate because the Fire Drake skull didn't quite look right. So I clipped the jaws in half so that I had the teeth section, smoothed out the cut, and then glued it to the side of the skull. Once both jaw sections were in place, I had a closer approximation to that original Fire Drake skull. Now that the bulk of the model had been built, I could begin working on improving the level of detail and further boosting that salamander theming. The first of these were quite straightforward and simply involved gluing some Salamander Primarch upgrade tools to the belt. For the next set of details, I liberated some more runes from the Fireslayer Hearthguard flails and, combined with some of those earlier runes that I'd used, I then lined the left shoulder pad. While I had already assembled the wings and the pack, I still wanted to customize it a little. For these additions, I once again used some Fireslayer parts. The first of these changes saw me attach a sling shield to the center of the pack. This helped to cover up some of the Slaaneshi iconography and also add more of those runes and flame motifs. Speaking of flames, I next created a couple of braziers by clipping away the ends of some Hearthguard Berserker flails. After cleaning up the cuts, I then used some more pinning to attach them to the pack. Like before, I made sure to do a dry fit just to make sure that the braziers didn't intersect with Vulkan's horns. My final step in building this Dragon Vulkan was to fix something I'd forgotten about earlier, the tongue. Rather than using the original Croxagore tongue, I instead sourced a longer, more whip-like tongue from the Demon Prince kit. After gluing it into place, the model itself was complete, which meant I could begin working on the base. After placing the tail against the base, I then steadily began to add some torn up chunks of cork floor tile to help add some texture. These were stacked and superglued to create a rocky surface, while still leaving space for the tail. Once I'd finished adding the cork, I next needed some extra basing details, which of course meant dead animal bits. Specifically, my own dead animal bits kit. Regular viewers will already be aware, but this is my very own kit, which is packed full of over 300 hard plastic bits ready to adorn your miniatures, bases, and scenery. Inside you will find all manner of expired creature parts, including shark jaws, bull horns, rib cages, femurs, impaled hands, severed heads, ram horns, antlers, feathers, teeth, and more. So whether you're looking to add some grotesque mutations, grisly trophies, or just some battlefield debris to your miniatures, then this kit has something for you. But by far the most useful detail about this set is that everything is made from hard plastic, making it perfect for clipping, trimming, and adjusting into whatever shape you need it to be. So if you're planning your next kit bash, or you just need some bones to add to your bases, Dead Animal Bits has you covered. I've partnered with Wargames Atlantic to produce this kit, so wherever you can find their other products, you can also find Dead Animal Bits, be it on their own website or through independent retailers like Element Games. I've also recently set up my very own web store for these too, where I have full boxes for those bigger projects and even individual sprues if you just want to see what the kit has to offer. Head on over to sparepartsemporium.com and pick up your own deceased crit components. I also package up and ship everything from that web store myself, so anything you buy from there really helps me out and it helps the channel out too. You can find all those links down in the description below, but for now, let's get back to basing Vulkan. From this kit, I removed a ribcage, clipped it in half, and glued it next to some rocks to give it a buried appearance. Following this, a few femurs were added in a similar way. Next, I grabbed a pair of the long spike hands and clipped the hand from one of them, but I kept that spike shape intact. With the first spike ready, I drilled a hole into the cork and superglued the empty spike into it. Next to this, I then superglued the second hand spike, but to add a little variation, I shortened the pole a little first. Following these, the base litter was further expanded with some citadel skulls. Now, to make painting a little easier, I had built the miniature as a series of sub-assemblies: the tail, the torso, the wings, and the base. These are all kept separate to make painting them easier, but I needed a way to handle them as I did so. So for the wings and torso, I added more pins in order to mount them to some painting handles. The tail section, this was glued to a much smaller 40mm base with a little super glue, and the full-size base was left completely separate. With the model and base complete, the painting could begin, and the first step in this was to pick a primer. I ultimately settled on Colourforge's Raven Black, which gave me an excellent dark starting point that would also work incredibly well for Vulkan's ash black skin. Now, to continue with Vulkan's skin, I next decided to build up the highlights, and for the first of these I mixed together some Eidolon Grey from the Tooth and Coats range with some thinners to spray them through my airbrush. This was sprayed onto the more raised sections of the skin, wings and tail, which allowed the darker Raven Black to create shading where it was still visible in the recesses and lower sections of the model. Next, I began the more traditional highlights using some Rodent Grey. This was painted directly onto those creases and folds in the skin. The lighter warm grey of this paint helped these details to stand out even further as it added contrast against the darker greys across the rest of the surface. To finish off the highlights, I next hit only the most prominent points of the model with an even lighter mixture created from rodent grey and elven skin. This was added in small points, which helped to strengthen these details, making them appear even more defined. With the skin complete, I next set about repeating those same steps in other areas of the model, and the first of these were the hard sections of carapace running along the tail and the head, as well as Vulkan's crest and horns. For all of these areas, I began with a subdued orangey red of Red Rage. But to help darken down those recesses a little, I hit this Red Rage base coat with a wash of Hellion Red. Before moving on to the highlights, the first of these was a regular highlight, and for this I used some Apocalypse Sky, with me following up with some small dots of Inferno Orange as an extreme highlight. To recreate the green armor of the Salamanders, I began with a base coat of Emerald Green. This was quite a bright green to apply over the black primer though, so I found it best to apply a couple of slightly watered down coats in order to create a good, solid starting colour. For the wash, I returned to the Hellion Red, but rather than applying it across the whole armour, I instead just focused this directly into those seams and recesses. The red of the wash contrasted nicely against the green and helped to build up how saturated it appeared. The armour was looking a little too pristine though, so I decided to add some scratches and scuffs using a little cuirass leather. Both the edges of the armour and the scratches were then highlighted with ethereal green. By lining these scratches, they helped to give them a slight three-dimensional effect that helped to make those surface defects look that little bit more realistic. Then, to help further boost the strength of that green colour, I hit all of the armour with a thin layer of green glaze. My final step in painting the armour was to add those extreme highlights, and for this I chose Talisman Green. With the green complete, I turned my attention to some of the remaining black areas. These included the ridged underarmour, the skull trophies, teeth, the hammer, and of course the volcanic rocks on the base. For all of these areas I used some Cold Corpse Blue, but rather than applying a highlight to the rocks, I instead switched to my dry brush to pick out that rocky texture. The cool blue highlights from the previous step were then further enhanced when I added a few small spots of Wolf Grey to them. My next areas of focus were the lizard skin tabard, the handle wrap of the hammer, and Vulkan's tongue. These were all base coated with Berserker Red. Then, rather than jumping straight to the highlights, I instead painted on a thin layer of Sanguine Scarlet across the folds of the lizard skin. The recesses were left as the darker red, and I built up my layers steadily, so the creases remained dark and the raised folds were lightened. From here, the normal highlights resumed, first with some Demon Red, and then Flaming Forge Orange for the extreme highlights. To paint all of the bone details, including those that I had scattered across the base, I began with a base coat of Dragonfang. The recesses of these bone details were then darkened with the help of some Battle Mud Wash, before I finished off with an initial highlight of Skeleton Legion, and then some Ivory Tusk. Next, I began working on all of the many golden details across the model. These covered the trims across the hammer and the armor, as well as the various little extra adornments that I'd added to Vulkan. All of these were given a base coat of Heirloom Gold. I then used the subtle reddish brown of Bone Wash to give the gold a slightly warmer hue, before picking out those edges with some of the paler gold of Platinum Crown. When it came to tackle the various gems inlaid into Vulkan's armor, I decided to give a slight nod to the original Fulgrim and paint them purple, specifically starting out with some Amethyst Rain. To create the effect of a gem, I painted a curved L shape of Sorcerer's Cloak onto the bottom left of each gem, keeping the darker Amethyst Rain in that top right. Then, using some Amulet Purple, I repeated the L shape, but focused even more towards the bottom left, creating a kind of gradient where the purple coloration darkened as it moved towards the upper right. Finally, the upper right of each gem was then carefully dotted with 2 small points of Trooper White to create the effect of a reflection on a glossy surface. The only remaining details on Vulkan that I had left to paint were the flames and other glowing details, and for all of these I started out with some Liquitex white acrylic ink. This ink not only has a very strong pigmentation, but it also thin enough to pool into recesses when you apply it to a surface. This ink was applied over the flames, the face on the hammer, and into Vulkan's eyes. I didn't worry about getting perfect coverage at this stage. My main focus was just getting those pure white points into those recesses. This uneven white surface allowed me to better recreate the effect of fire as I applied some yellow glaze over the top. Fire is brightest at the point of origin and darkens as it moves outwards, so as the recesses were pure white, they became the brightest points of yellow, with the outer points of the flames being a darker yellow. These dark points were then hit with orange glaze, which began to form a gradient starting out with yellow, then orange, and finally red, which was added with some red glaze and to just the most prominent tongues of fire. Once this step was completed, I was left with some more realistic looking flames. From here, I could return to the base, but first I had to remove Vulkan's tail from its temporary base and clean up the contact points of any residual superglue and paint. With this done, the tail was compared against the base, and I then used a pencil to mark out the tail's edges. This left me with a guide on where to add my texture paste. In this case, I chose some Fireland from AK Interactive. This rich red colour would complement my Vulkan perfectly, and cause those black-blue rocks to stand out even further. I applied the paste across the whole base, carefully avoiding the already painted details and leaving that centre area clear. Once the texture paste had dried, Vulkan could finally be assembled. But first, the wire holders had to be removed and the contact points cleared of paint. With all this done, Vulkan could finally be assembled, which left me with a little dry brushing around the outer rim of the base with some Fanatic orange, followed by some orange flare to just the very outer edge. By applying the paint towards the rim, I had created the effect of Vulkan casting a shadow across the ground beneath him. With the base also complete, I gave the whole model a coat of matte varnish, leaving me with this. And that was how I built and painted this Chaos Corrupted interpretation of Vulkan, Primarch of the Salamanders. Now, as soon as I saw the reveals for Fulgrim, I knew I would have to use this kit to build one of the other Primarchs, and while there are good alternatives, I think an alternate version of Vulkan fits the bill the best. However, while the worm-like body of Fulgrim's miniature matched the Salamander's association with drakes and other reptilian beasts, it wasn't perfect. By far, my biggest challenge in this build was bulking out the torso. Fulgrim's is, understandably, lithe and slender, and that just didn't quite fit in with either Vulkan's humanoid appearance or that of a Chaos Dragon, Primarch hybrid thing. But while the fleshing out of the torso size was a little tricky, finding those Salamander-esque details, fortunately, was not. As I've demonstrated in previous videos, the Old World Dwarves and Age of Sigmar Fireslayers are wonderful for representing your Salamanders, be they 40k, Horus Heresy, or even Chaos Corrupted. Now, if this is the first of my custom Primarch builds that you've watched and you would like to see more, then I'd highly recommend watching my previous videos where I've tackled a Khorne Leman Russ, an Orc Angron, and both a Loyalist and Elder versions of Conrad Kurz. And as always, if you have any ideas or suggestions for which Primarchs you'd like to see me tackle, then let me know down in the comments below. If you'd like to recreate this or any of my conversions, then you can find links to all the kits down in the description below, including where you can pick up my Dead Animal Bits kit. If you're in the UK or the US, check out my website, www.sparepartsemporium.com, and if you're in the EU or other parts of the world, then you can find them on the Wargames Atlantic web store as well. But before I go, let me say a huge thank you to everyone who continues to help keep the channel going. And if you would like to support me too, you can get early access to ad-free videos, exclusive merchandise, and even your name in the credits. Simply follow my Patreon link below or hit the join button, just like my top Patreon supporters did, who are Nail5, Adrian Ruiz, Ban Yevrian, Berserker, Daniel Dowling, George Kanzini Roberts, Immaterial Creations, Cornbread, Maciej Savitsky, Matt Brower, Molly Mork, Older Than Time, Ryan Little, Sam Sepulveda, Swedsman, Tim, and War Novice. And my top channel members who are
Alex Verne, Bon Johnson, Dave, Doug H, Guy Bizant, Lil Ely, Mark Taylor, Nerdington Paints, Omnitom, Philip Poya, S.O., Satoran, S.J. Carper, That One Tech Priest, The Sire Acquired, and Whale Tussler. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.